All right, we're recording.
Excellent. We're on our second session of Machiavelli's The Prince. Um, Second and last, since it's a short work and we're cutting it up in two. Um, did you want to open with anything, or
I can, yeah. Hold on, let me open up to the beginning of where we started. So we started at chapter 15.
correct?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we were talking about last time is, a lot of his ideas are very rooted in history,
Mm-hmm.
very empirical. And let me try find the quote. Where was it? At the beginning of 15, yeah, at second paragraph, he says, "So leaving aside imaginary things about a prince and referring only to those which truly exist, I say that whenever men are discussed, and especially princes, who are more exposed to view, they are judged for various qualities which earn them either praise or condemnation." And then he goes on to say basically that we're not going to consider imaginary things or these ideas of the ideal prince or things like that that other philosophers have
Exactly.
discussed, but we're going to talk about only what is actually like what we can actually find examples of, um, which
Or yeah, or as he says in 15, like quoting represent things as they really are, rather than they're imagined. Clearly, that's
yeah.
a dig at least Plato, maybe Aristotle, but Aristotle was still pretty empirical,
Yeah.
as we talked about.
Yes. Um, so there was that. There's definitely a couple other things that I noticed that kind of respond to what we were talking about last time, or answered some questions maybe.
Okay.
Um, this is, I mean, I guess this is jumping around a little bit, but what chapter is this in? This is in 21,
Okay.
how a prince must act to win honor, and I think it's the fifth paragraph, and it begins with, "Here it is to be noted that a prince should never join in an aggressive alliance with someone more powerful than himself, unless it is a
Right.
matter of necessity, as I said above." And that's kind of, so we had talked about like maybe there's a situation where you would, like we were talking about situations where you go into an alliance with someone during a war, and we were wondering if that would ever be beneficial. And here he's kind of saying it's preferable if you are more powerful, the more
Mhm.
powerful person
Mhm.
in the alliance, because then after the the war, the situation is over, then you're not like you're not under their shadow. You're not under your ally's
You're
shadow.
right. If you are weaker than the other, you're
Vulnerable.
vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I think he did say he pointed to like one or two instances where it might like you might just have to do it because there's no other way. Um,
Right. Right. In other words, it's like it's yeah, right, out of necessity.
yeah. Kind of a general theme of things that I've noticed. Like I feel like the way that he goes about describing the prince is what's the word? So it's very logically founded, and I think it's very utilitarian in the fact that it's for the benefit of the prince. Like it's kind of
Yeah.
selfish in that regard.
Yeah.
But there are also a lot of instances where he talks about like being between the vices. So
Hmm.
it's kind of a mix of utilitarian for the prince's benefit, but also some sort of virtue mixed in because there
Hmm.
is no there like he's basically saying there are no absolutes, um, and it all is dependent on the context of the situation that the prince exists in. Um, so I just thought that was interesting that he was kind of combining those two ideas together.
No, I'm with you on that. It also reminds me of where he says basically you the wise prince is or the smart prince is flexible,
Hmm.
meaning in other words like whatever the times are dictating. Um, the yeah, the prince ultimately needs to be somewhat flexible, which opens up the notion that he could actually be doing certain things that are virtuous depending on the times.
Hmm.
And then depend. I mean, it's almost it's a bit like what we and you probably covered this when you did a little bit of ethics in the past, but it almost reminds me of a sort of situational ethics.
Yeah.
right? So you might employ, ethic A in this instance, but now you're in a new situation. Now you have to do non-A, the exact opposite of it.
Hmm.
So it's not as if there's sort of this one size fits all ethic that you need to apply constantly, regardless of the times or the situations. But it might be. I mean, I'd go back sort of the utilitarian thing that you said. This one's useful now, but it's not in another situation.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah. And it's useful to him. It's not useful to the like. It's not necessarily. It's not to the utility of the group.
Mm-hmm,
Right.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Because everything is about sort of holding on to your own rule, holding on to your power.
Hmm.
You know. I thought this. I mean, to go back to the one about early on in 15,
Hmm.
represent things as they really are rather than they're imagined. Many have dreamed up republics
Hmm.
that never have existed. You know,
Yeah.
it makes me wonder whether or not there's some truth to, or not truth to it, but like to what degree then are the? I mean, let's say that he was right, and there is sort of this. He even talks about, and I want to bring this up later, but the conditions of the world is his language,
Hmm.
wrapped up with his theory of human nature, which we can get to later. But if it is the case that there are certain conditions in the world, and human nature is, structured in such a way, due to, I would imagine he probably pretty much views this as sort of like sophisticated animals, but still animals. Then really, what would be the purpose of developing utopias, right?
Hmm.
What would be the purpose of developing an ideal state? Because if he's right on that premise, they'll just never come to fruition, you know.
Hmm.
So if you were having this dialogue with, we put Plato down with Machiavelli, I can imagine Machiavelli would continue to route him back to the idea that this is all great, it's interesting, but it's just not how the world works,
Sure.
and you're not going to, you're fundamentally not, maybe you're spinning your wheels, wasting time because you're ultimately not going to be able to bring it to fruition.
Yeah.
I mean, that's if its premise is right. I mean, the flip side, obviously, is there's something very beautiful about what Plato does, right? In terms of developing this ideal, so it's intellectually interesting,
Yeah.
and also too, Plato might respond to him by saying that you're settling. You're sort of settling with the way things quote unquote are, as opposed to pushing yourself to a higher ideal. And you can even maybe look at various protest movements, like the civil rights movement or something like that. I mean, would those have even taken off if they had sort of this Machiavellian pessimism, right?
Hmm.
Or they had ideals, Martin Luther King Jr. and others, where they were saying, yeah, this is the way the world has been. It's not the way the world has to be.
Hmm.
And they continue to push in that direction, and then we get the Civil Rights Act. And now, you can't be racist in the workplace. You can't be, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So, and that's all based on idealism, not based on settling, as it were, for the way in which the world is.
Right.
So I think you can look at maybe like some specific example, and it'd be interesting to see how Machiavelli would respond to that. Could he use a Machiavellian analysis to still say, yeah, well, even the civil rights movement is somehow I can still explain it with my tools and my theory. I don't know if he could.
Hmm.
Right? What how does that fit with you? Specifically, the ideal versus the sort of realpolitik?
Um, well, um, it's interesting. I mean, if you sat Plato and Machiavelli down, Plato being in his head all the time, like he's up in the clouds,
Right, right.
thinking about all these things, and he even states like, his arguments are all logical, and he states his assumptions, of how the people will act in the city. Um, Whereas Machiavelli is like, hey, this is how people act in the world, and he also approaches it from a
Hmm.
pretty logical standpoint. So it's not like either of them is wrong. Um,
Right.
it's interesting. It's interesting to think about, like when you bring in morals into the situation. I think I lean towards Plato's mindset because I
Sure.
prefer the group over the individual. Um, but I can see how other people would be more attuned to Machiavelli's thinking. Um, and what's interesting is when you brought up the idealism, right? Like if you take it as more of a goal, um, and something that you can try to progress towards over time, I think that's like it's probably the best way to think about it. Like I don't know if you're ever going to achieve like the philosopher king or the ideal city. Um,
Hmm.
but if your goal, if that's your goal, then making the best steps to get there is the best thing to do. And whether or not that includes some of Machiavelli's um, steps along the way,
Right.
that's an interesting question.
It's interesting too. I just thought about while we were talking, or while you were talking about the Machiavelli. At one point says when he's describing the prince, I think this is in last week's reading, that the prince ought to. Now this is for totally self-interested motives or out of self-interested motives. But he says he uses the image of the archer needs to aim high, like really high, higher than you would like imagine, right?
Hmm.
In order to achieve all of um, what Machiavelli would say are sort of the traits of the prince, right?
Hmm.
All of these ultra masculine traits, which which he clearly endorses, right?
Hmm.
But he talks about sort of aiming high, and that like aiming higher than you can even imagine yourself achieving, which sort of is similar to what the idealist does. You know, um, in other words, you're sort of going outside of reality. The idealist is saying, I want the world to look this particular way. I'm aiming really high. I might not hit the mark. At least I'm aiming, high. And that's somewhat similar to what he's saying about the prince. Of course, his is limited to the prince and the prince's prowess. Um, but also it's a little off reality. You know what I'm saying? Like in other words, I guess what I'm saying is, I think he does have certain ideals that are not rooted in reality for the prince to ultimately achieve ultimate power.
Hmm.
Which is again what protest movements that have been successful. They've done the same thing, only it hasn't been for the individual; it's been for a group. You know.
Hmm.
I mean, I would say maybe even if that is somewhat idealistic of Machiavelli, that's just it. There isn't any idealism beyond that.
Sure.
Um, but I think I mean, I feel like what he does is he creates like a really interesting puzzle then with what we've read thus far. For it's almost sort of like a dualism that we really haven't seen until Machiavelli, and that
Hmm.
is, do you shoot for creating an ideal world, which according to Plato anyway is going to be full of these virtues and certain structures of order, and thinking about the good of the whole. And then that's on one side, and then the other side is politics is dirty work. Politics requires vice well, at least to maintain power, and that's that's the way in which the world actually works. So it's sort of like we just have the only other sort of dualism we've had, I would say, would be the city of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very clear dualism, city of God, city of man. But I feel like with all we've read, we now have these two sort of competing views of politics that don't mesh, and I think he presents like an important puzzle for us to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
Which is it? Is it dirty work full of vices, or is it shooting for ideals and utopias?
Mm-hmm. And can can Machiavelli's prince like come across as though he's the philosopher king, but with his own motives? Is that even possible?
Yeah. I see. I would say not,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean, we talked about this last week. The focus of Plato is the ultimate goal with Plato's ideal city and the philosopher king is just the opposite of Machiavelli's prince, right? I mean, in other words, if you were to follow the text as a manual,
No,
what you would get out of it is pretty much the grip on power. The grip on power is what matters, and then for Plato, it's not that.
right. I'm saying like
So,
could a prince come across as the philosopher king to his
oh,
people, but
yes. Oh my
act
God,
with
yes.
his own motives as the
Totally,
prince? Yeah.
totally.
So
In
everyone
fact,
would
in my notes,
believe that he is a philosopher king and that he's doing things for the group, but
yes,
he's not really.
exactly. Oh, totally. I think he would entirely endorse that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in my notes, I had a couple of titles, one of which was appearance versus reality,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like that's huge for Machiavelli. The idea of appearing, or he uses the word having a reputation of being, right? Not being, but having the reputation of being. It was in 17, the classically titled chapter, Whether It Is Better to Be Loved Than Feared.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about having a reputation for compassion rather than cruelty. I mean, I think the reality, too, is he can't be too cruel. But
Yeah.
that element of the reputation, so this projection to the populace is a running theme of his
Mm-hmm.
throughout. It's funny. I was actually thinking about it because, I mean, obviously, one take on it is, if you play up the whole language of authenticity, right,
Mm-hmm.
then appearance or the reputation of being is problematic because you're not authentically that thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I was thinking as well. I was like, it's funny. Since I've been alive, and have encountered politics, as a child and teenager and into adulthood, it's like, I've actually never known any president firsthand. I mean, I don't even really know what I'm getting at here, other than the only thing you do have, at least in this world, at least in our world, which is pretty different from Machiavelli's, at least in terms of, like, he's talking about a prince of a principality,
Mm-hmm.
and we have sort of presidents, and they didn't have the telecommunications that we have now. It's like, I only ever see the surface appearance of a politician. I've never known anyone in the Senate. I've never known anyone in the House of Representatives. I've never known any president.
Mm-hmm.
I only ever am encountering what they project. And by the way, that's not their fault. That's just, whatever. It's due to the how large the country is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of interesting, like, you do have. I mean, there is something about having a reputation, even if you don't really know the person themselves, right? This is very true, like with sort of an online presence, even for someone that's not a politician, right?
Yep.
You get a reputation by what you're posting, or how you're responding to posts, and so on and so forth. So there is, I feel like like I somewhat get what I agree with part of what he's saying, that the part that basically says you only have sort of the projection to deal with as a subject anyway within a nation. But the part obviously that I have a problem with would be that he doesn't really care. He doesn't really care about what your internal character actually is.
Right.
That would be the that would be the part that I would take issue with. But I wouldn't take issue with the fact that reputation is very important. Like I think that's the part I would agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of what we're stuck with as citizens if we're not in the political mix, actually knowing those who are in power on a personal level.
Yeah.
Two things I wanted to bring up, which I thought were really interesting, and I mentioned them earlier, is that he does have, and I always find these pieces really interesting within a theory, that there are various aspects of his overall theory that need to be questioned. And the one is he uses the language of the condition of the world. This is it first comes up in 15.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see. Well, he actually just mentions conditions of the world without explaining it in 15. And then later, let me see. Where did he put that? Well, actually, I think conditions of the world is wrapped up in the second point. The second point is his view of human nature. So, in other words, due to the conditions of the world, this came up in 15. It was like, due to the conditions of the world, you need to, basically vices are necessary, okay? And then later, he sort of clarifies human nature. This is in 17, where he says, quote, well, I'm not quoting it in full, but it's something, men are, now the quote, ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger, and they're greedy for profit. And so because of human nature, which is wrapped up in the condition of the world, one necessarily has to use vices over virtues.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I feel like these pieces are interesting to pick on is whether or not, and probably you could easily come back to me with a deluge of examples in human history, but whether or not he's right? Because, so in other words, it's all interconnected. You have to use vices because we're in this particular game that is vicious,
Mm-hmm.
and with people who are vicious. So we're playing by the rules of this particular game. But it begs the question whether or not that really is the essence of human nature, right? In other words, just to give an example, I mean, clearly we're not angels, so it's not like we're constantly, but there are people that live more virtuously than others.
Mm-hmm.
We are not, maybe even those that he describes, as ungrateful, fickle, etc. Are they those things 100% of the time, right? I mean, how are they with family? How are they, with friends? And the other thing is maybe it's not the case that is true of human nature per se, but maybe human nature is an open space and it can be filled with either, right?
Yeah. It's an interesting
So
topic. It was something I was thinking
yeah.
about. So I mean, you cannot deny that people act those ways, right?
Hmm.
Or at least a subset of people act those ways.
Right.
If Now, can you make the conclusion that you must act those ways in order to respond that you're because other people act those ways?
Right.
That's really the question, right?
Right.
Um, you can't say, oh, well, because everyone acts this, like everyone is bound to act this way sometimes, then I must act this way to compensate. I don't think that's a fair uh, way to go about it.
Right.
Especially like, okay, the only case where that might work is if literally everyone acted this way all the time, right? Because
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
you'd get nowhere otherwise. If you're the only
Right.
person trying to go against the grain, you'd get nowhere. Um, so I think you bring up an interesting point in that, like, uh, how can we use that information, or how does it actually manifest itself? And
Right.
I think so. Saint Augustine would probably argue that people act these ways. I don't think he would argue that they act these ways all the time. Um,
Right.
and I think that's important when you're making an analysis about this. I don't think you can say that people never act these ways either, right? Like, I think
No. No. Agreed.
every single person will act in these ways some percentage of the time, right?
Right.
Or in certain circumstances. Um, so Yeah, so because of that, I feel like it's not fair to say I have to use these methods, to combat um, the the environment, um,
Right.
the political environment, which is why I feel like being like having virtues is very effective because people can see both sides, right? If people were
Hmm.
only cruel and deceitful, um, then they wouldn't they wouldn't admire someone who is virtuous, right?
Right.
But people have both sides they can see both sides of the coin, so they'll gravitate towards people who are virtuous because they themselves admire that.
Hmm.
And some people admire having power, and that's a different thing. So they might try to align or get in the prince's circle of you know individuals. So I think yeah, it's definitely more complicated than like oversimplifying. Hey, everyone acts this way. I must respond by acting in these ways so that I can make the most of the situation. Um,
Right.
like I when I think of things like this, I don't know if you're familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk.
No.
Okay, he's a popular media person. He has a
Hmm.
bunch of businesses. He started a wine business in California. That's kind of where he started.
Hmm.
He's really
Okay.
popular on Instagram, and his whole deal is basically like don't care what people think about you. Um, just be compassionate, be open,
Right.
and just do what your gut tells you to do. Basically, like don't take
Right.
advantage of people. Just very straightforward, very upfront, and that will get you a long way is basically his thing. um,
Right.
and it's interesting because he says that, and yet he also like I don't want to say takes advantage of, but he takes advantage of like the internet and like how social media works because
Hmm.
he kind of plays that system, but he does it in his own way
Sure.
because he's upfront about it. um, so yeah, I think there's definitely a value to being transparent and being virtuous over just acting like this prince.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I think that um, I guess the thing I thought about was sort of, and it might not be the exact um, sort of terminology, but I was sort of thinking about game theory,
Hmm.
and I was sort of thinking about like that depending on what game is being played, there are certain there's certain structures in place that make you do certain things, right? I mean, like a great example would be chess, right? There are particular rules at play. There's a particular objective, and so you're doing certain things to you have to abide by the rules, right? One, or you can't play the game. And there are certain things you have to do in terms of achieving your objective, one of which actually is a certain level of trickery, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this happens in all sports, like faking someone out, right? You're delivering an appearance, but the reality is different, right? So, like, is it the case that with he says it in 19, like, a prince who wants to maintain his rule is often forced not to be good. So forced not to be good, this is my own language, because, well, actually, no, I think he even says this too, men are corrupt, right? And by men, he means the soldiers, populace, and the nobles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is he therefore forced to, I mean, obviously your example is going to say no. Plato would say no. But is he forced then to, be vicious, and employ vices because of the game in which he's playing, I also think that this is the tricky part, because each time I say that, I'm always thinking, yeah, but the objective is holding on to power. And I think for you and I, and certainly for Plato and Aristotle and Augustine, though they will have slight disagreements, we would say, no, there's more to politics, and there's more to the role of the leader than holding on to power. So, but I imagine if you reduce it to corruption, corrupt individuals, and then the goal of the leader is to maintain his power, then everything else follows from it. So the sticking points, and by everything else, I mean the rest of what he says and encourages. So the sticking points for us then are going to be, it is not the sole purpose of the leader to hold power. And even though men are corrupt, that doesn't mean that you need to employ vices in order to get things done.
Mm-hmm.
Those, I think, are going to be the sticking points. But the game theory element interests me, right? Because he is actually thinking about, as he says, the conditions of the world, the structure of the system. And when you have the structure and you have components which are corrupt individuals, and you are in power, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the flip side of this too is he can't be the prince. He can't be a total tyrant.
Yeah, well, he even said this in
Yeah,
18. He said you can't, you shouldn't be the lion, you should be the fox, who's like
right.
there's a keenness that's required. You can't just be so forceful. You have to take it, like he takes into account the consideration of the environment, in that there's this weird balance of, if you want to control it and have power, you have to, you can't just control it and have power, because it will go against you. There's
Right.
certain ways you have to manipulate it so that um, it gives back to you, that, so that the people around you want to stick around you. You know?
Exactly. Which means that, and this is the interesting thing, that it is, so in other words, is he really about just the prince holding on to power? Or is that a limited interpretation of Machiavelli? Is it really sort of twofold or threefold, whatever, that yes, the prince needs to hold on to power, but in so holding on to power, there are going to be certain goods that are created, because you won't be able to hold on to power if you were the ultimate tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, where does he say? He's in 19, he says that you have to avoid being hated. By the way, he said that a lot.
Yep.
Avoid being hated and despised. And then he says, if you have the goodwill of the people, and this was about the conspiracies, then you have no need to worry about conspiracies. So, in other words, I understand it goes back to the leader holding power, but you're only going to have the goodwill of the people if they're at least minimally happy,
Mm-hmm.
right? you're only going to have the goodwill of the soldiers so they don't conspire if they're going to be able to, if you're going to share the spoils of war,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the interesting side here is that I feel like it's possibly a too narrow interpretation of the prince to just say it's all about the prince.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
It, it,
Yeah.
it, it, it I mean, you could say yes, but even the goods that other people are getting, it goes back to the prince and his grip on power. But you can't deny they're still getting some goods. They're still getting
Yeah.
some benefits.
Right.
Okay, and again, it could be the case that if we then do the massive, comparison, maybe they're not getting as much benefits as you would in Plato's ideal city, but they have to be getting something. Otherwise, he's not going to hold on to his power. He won't be prince anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that ends up creating sort of an interesting spin on the prince that it is just about him, but it's not.
Yeah.
Or in so being just about him, other people have to are gaining some benefits.
Right. Because
And I'm
he's
sort of thinking of what do they call it? The benevolent dictator, right? In other words, you've got like the dictator who wants to hold on to power, but he's benevolent. He's actually giving sort of the people what they want, and at the same time, being a dictator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, that's, I guess that's sort of, you take that piece that the populace is receiving some benefits, right?
Yeah.
And then you add to it the traits that, this is also 19, he says the traits that the prince should engender are grandeur, courage, sobriety, strength, right? And we talked about this last time about courage, right? He's not entirely against all the virtues,
Mm-hmm.
right? He doesn't encourage cowardice. Sobriety is a good one too, right? You can't. I think it's in this section where you can't be like excessive,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I'm getting at is that they're even though it's so like self-centered, this text, there are pieces that are other-oriented,
Yeah.
or granted, the courage is for those lists of virtues, as it were, is for the prince, but yeah, what I said earlier, I think it's interesting. It goes back to the whole break a few eggs in order to make an omelet. The people are getting something.
Yeah. Because he's got to avoid conspirators. There's a whole
Mm-hmm.
section on conspirators.
Yeah.
Like he must be busy enough, or they must be going. He must be busy enough that there's no time for conspirators, right? He
Right.
gave an example. I forget who it was. He gave an example, a historical example, because there's a lot of these in here, where I guess they just went battle after battle, and there was no time in between to be like, oh, this is there's no time to get back at him. Oh, there was
Right.
one thing that was interesting. You mentioned the people versus, I guess, the soldiers. Is that what it was? Um,
Right.
like there's this kind of idea that there are two groups of people in this principality, I guess. And like the prince uses the soldiers to acquire more land to protect the what he
Right.
already has, but the people are ultimately the what he's protecting.
Right.
And when it comes to conspirators, like they could come from either the people or the soldiers. Um, and I don't know exactly what was I trying to say. Basically, he has to maintain a balance between those groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, I think actually there are three in addition to the leader, right? There's the populace, so citizens.
mhm.
There's the soldiers, and then there's the nobles, right? And the nobles, I feel like would be the equivalent to, our Congress, right?
Okay,
So
well, yeah, but those are
they're
in his direct circle, right?
sure,
Yeah, that's a smaller group.
yeah.
Yeah. Um,
But he's
And
got to keep all of those happy to some degree,
yeah.
right? Um,
Well, he's the one choosing the nobles, so hopefully he chooses wisely.
right, right.
Right? Like,
But
oh,
let's see.
they're not going to
Yeah,
conspire against me. There's a
right,
section about that at the
right.
end.
Hmm.
A prince's personal staff in 22. Um, I think there was also a section about what, like beginning of what we read, was it 15 or 16? About
Hmm.
being generous. What was it? Yeah, generosity and parsimony. Um,
Hmm.
that he shouldn't give. What was it? He shouldn't give of his own, like his own things. Like he shouldn't be generous in that. Um,
Right,
yeah,
right.
giving away what belongs to strangers in no way affects your standing at home.
Yes,
Rather, it increases
yes.
it.
No, I thought that was really interesting, right? That's why I think that connected to the soldiers, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like you're attacking another country, you get the spoils of war. There's no point to hoard them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you know that it doesn't affect. Yeah, you're standing at home. It doesn't affect whatever properties, etc. You own, and it will make the soldiers happy,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, we've attacked them. You know, and here's the booty. You know, distribute it among yourselves. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting too that I mean he doesn't make this connection, but it just popped in my head that in the Iliad that becomes the problem of the opening of the epic, that basically the prince, as it were, Agamemnon, is um, uh, he's not being as generous, as it were, in distributing the booty. And I mean, there are other sort of mythological divine elements involved, but that ends up being a problem between Agamemnon, the king, and Achilles, the soldier.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's animosity and there's rage, and that ends up, um, you know, keeping Achilles out of the Trojan War, of which they need him to be in the war. But Achilles just I mean, Achilles even says to Agamemnon's face that he's a hoarder, and that creates acrimony.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so wow.
Yeah.
I sort of in conclusion, I liked reading this.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what's really interesting is that there's a type of honesty that he has, another virtue, in his describing, or at least as he sees it, in his describing of um, the political world and the political scene. You know, I mean, he's not trying at all, at least in writing all of this, to um, to project an image. He seems to be very honest. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is how I see the world working. This is what the prince needs to do. This is how you hold on to power. You know, and so there's something sort of satisfying in at least in him being honest and very clear in his um, proposals. Um, and actually, and you've mentioned this as well, there's a type of logic at
Yeah.
play.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have X, Y, and Z objectives, then you need to do A, B, and C to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is interesting. And I think what's really interesting too is that it just flattens out. I'm not saying I agree with this, but in terms of having variety in what we're reading, totally flattens out the idealism of. I mean, we could even add Augustine as well, because of the city of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just flattens out the idealism of the political theory that we've been looking at. So just it presents a very interesting contrast to what we've been reading. There's no theory of sort of the ideal city.
Mm-hmm.
None of that.
Yep.
So even though I disagree a lot with a lot of what he's saying, I appreciate the text in terms of, well, one, engaging it with you, but also just thinking about sort of the nature of politics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so Hobbes will become very interesting. I know we're spending a chunk on the Leviathan. We're reading most all of it, and it's not a really short book.
Mm-hmm.
But his will be sort of an interesting one to read right after Machiavelli, because there, I mean, I won't give everything away, but I know that there will be some premises that that he agrees with Machiavelli on.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it'll be our first thinker. Locke will follow this tradition, but it'll be our first thinker that actually develops one of the biggest pieces of political theory, which is the social contract theory.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, which Locke will continue, and then when we get around, I think after that we're doing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that the framers actually embrace as well, this sort of working notion of the social contract theory.
Mm-hmm. That'll be
So,
interesting.
no doubt. Well, good, Christian.
Yeah.
Always a joy.
Indeed.
What are your concluding comments on this?
This was the most contextual, nuanced text that we have read thus far.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair.
um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I really like how um, it isn't up in the clouds and theoretical because
Hmm.
we've gotten that, and I mean, I feel like those are easier for me to understand. So this was interesting in that like it was different from those. Um,
Right,
and it makes like from his point of view, it makes sense. Um,
right,
and it helps to explain how certain people do act in the world or have acted in the world, and why people might act in the world.
hmm,
So I think it's helpful. Like I think it's a useful thing for
yeah,
observing the actions of people and evaluating them. Whereas what we've read before is very theoretical and it's like, you know, it's more idealistic than cause and
right,
effect.
totally. You know, there's one thing that came to mind, and this will be my last conclusion, is that, and he brings up in the first part, but it's about Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and it's interesting that Jesus had a type of power that's very different from the prince, because he has no arms, right? The only prince that matters for Machiavelli is the one that has his own arms, right? His
Mm-hmm.
own army, military. Jesus, no military, no weapons, basically all teaching,
Mm-hmm.
and it it's whatever spreads among a small group, and then it spreads beyond that group. It this is a group of Christians that have absolutely no typical power in the military and political sense of it, right? Because it was an illegal religion for the first 300 years of its
Mm-hmm.
existence within the Roman Empire, and yet it continues to build momentum and really ends up taking over the world, at least the Roman world, because because Constantine has his conversion, so he's
Yep.
an emperor, and then becomes like the state religion. So that's really an interesting element of
Ye-
a, as it were, prince. Well, yeah, we can call Jesus the prince, right? The Prince
Mm-hmm.
of Peace. A prince that doesn't that betrays a lot of the traits of Machiavelli's prince, but nonetheless has an immense impact on the world.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, and
which also raises sort of an interesting counter to some of what Machiavelli says.
yeah, and he even addressed that when he talked. He briefly mentioned the papacy and how
Yeah.
you know, that is set up. Like a lot of what he was talking about of how princes gain rule is either by taking it over or through like hereditary means. But the
Hmm.
papacy is against both of those things
Right. Right.
because they are elected from
Papacy.
papacy. Sorry,
Yeah.
and they are elected from
Yes.
by by the
From their
leaders of
own.
that
Mhm.
group.
Exactly. So that's that's it's an interesting sort of like concluding thought,
Hmm.
about about actually sort of what we were saying earlier about the role of sort of the virtuous response in a world that's fraught with corruption, right?
Hmm.
Which is what Jesus is. Turning the other cheek, humility, all of these traits, um, and it doesn't just die out. um, and maybe that's a commentary more on how a message can spread, but also too, it could be the case of Machiavelli because he brings this up a lot. Talks about the opportunity. So was it the case within a very oppressive regime like the Roman Empire that the people they were they needed this particular message, and the message ends up right, heavy taxation, a very deep caste system, as it were, within the empire, a lot of unhappiness. And then you have someone that literally comes in with the good news, with with hope.
Hmm.
So Machiavelli might respond by saying, "Yeah, it's opportunity," and also too, um, other pieces in terms of like eternal life versus just sort of a temporal life that ends up in death, so on and so forth. There are other pieces there that could really mobilize a people.
Yeah.
But still, it's interesting. No arms, no military, right? No political power. At least when Jesus was starting.
Right. Yeah.
So, all right, listen, I got to bounce. Thank you very much. We will pick up with Hobbes next week.
Sounds good.